During World War II, many national and military leaders had brushes with death, and some actually died. In a previous video, we saw how British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was nearly killed by German artillery fire in 1945 while visiting the Rhine River front. Travel by plane was particularly hazardous, but virtually every World War II leader used aircraft to quickly move around, and some faced hair-raising incidents. Top generals in particular used light aircraft to visit the front lines and units for particular reasons. Some years ago, I made a video about the Allied use of the German Fieseler Fi-156 Storch reconnaissance and communications aircraft. British General Sir Bernard Montgomery was a fan and used a captured example as a communications plane in North Africa during the fight against Rommel's Afrika Korps, the plane itself being Rommel's own personal Storch, which had been captured by the British. See the link in the end screen. By the time of the campaign through France into Germany in 1944-45, now Field Marshal Montgomery had transitioned to a British aircraft, the Miles M38 Messenger. Unlike the Storch, which could only accommodate a pilot and 1 or 2 passengers, the Messenger was a 4-seater liaison and spotter plane. It was designed to also be a very stable spotter platform and could fly at very low speeds. Only 93 were ever built, and several were used as VIP passenger transports during and just after the war. It was in a Messenger that Montgomery was involved in an accident that nearly took his life just after the war. By late August 1945, World War II was over. Germany had surrendered in early May, leaving the British as the occupying power in the north of the country, and Japan had also stopped fighting on the 15th of August. The Allied fighting armies had now transitioned to occupation troops, and the fighting generals had now become effectively governors of occupied Germany. Montgomery, probably the most famous British military leader of World War II, certainly the most recognizable, a spry little man with a nasal voice, wearing a black beret adorned with a Field Marshal's badge and a Royal Tank Regiment cap badge, had come to prominence during the previously mentioned desert campaign in North Africa, where his 8th Army had defeated the Afrika Korps, the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt in 1942, precipitating a German retreat to Tunisia, the Afrika Korps eventually surrendering there in 1943. Monty, as he was affectionately known to the troops, had commanded British forces during the Anglo-American invasion of Sicily in 1943, and many American viewers may not be aware that during D-Day, the June 1944 landings in Normandy, Monty commanded all Allied ground forces, British, Canadian and American. Later, he commanded the 21st Army Group, the Anglo-Canadian collection of armies that pushed into Belgium, the Netherlands, and then Germany until the final surrender. Like his U.S. counterpart, General George S. Patton, Monty was a controversial, strong-willed, and often difficult commander whose reputation today remains divisive and debated in historical circles. What cannot be denied was the fact that Monty was a superstar of the era, and his loss would have been considered a national tragedy in Britain. So it was on the morning of the 22nd of August 1945, Monty set off in his M38 Messenger aircraft from his headquarters to visit one of the Allied occupation units under his command, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division. He was supposed to land at Oldenburg airfield in Lower Saxony, address the officers and men, and then make a medal presentation. His personal plane was piloted by a very experienced RAF officer, Flight Lieutenant Martin, and travelling with Monty was his personal aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Noel Chavasse of the Middlesex Regiment. Chavasse was named for his famous uncle, Captain Noel Chavasse, who in World War I had been awarded the Victoria Cross twice, an accomplishment that has only occurred on 3 occasions since Britain's highest gallantry award was created in 1856. Lieutenant Chavasse had himself been awarded the Military Cross for gallantry in the North African campaign, as well as the U.S. Air Medal for making hazardous air reconnaissance missions spotting enemy positions over the front lines. The flight to Oldenburg was only 100 miles and was perfectly routine. There had been a spate of attacks on Allied occupation forces in the months following the German surrender, the so-called werewolf activities, involving small groups of Nazi fanatics and diehards that involved some shooting incidents, assassination attempts against officials, arson against Allied property, cutting of telephone wires, and the like. The messenger took off without incident and flew to its destination, but as Flight Lieutenant Martin was approaching the airfield, his flaps down and airspeed low, the messenger's engine abruptly packed up. Losing altitude rapidly, Martin realized that he couldn't make the airstrip, so attempted to put the plane down on a road adjoining the airfield, but a wing clipped a tree as the messenger came in to land and crashed, its wings torn off and the men inside violently thrown around. Martin and Lieutenant Chavasse were lucky. They escaped with hardly a scratch, but Monty was much worse off. Pulled from the wreckage, the Field Marshal had broken 2 of his lumbar vertebrae, as well as being severely shaken and bruised by the ordeal. He was in considerable discomfort from his injury, but he admitted that it could have been much worse. It was a lucky escape, but as he wrote, with a less skillful pilot, the results might have been much more serious. Monty was determined to conduct the planned visit and insisted on being driven to the headquarters of the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division. There he addressed the men and distributed some medals, but broke off halfway through the visit as he was feeling too unwell. It was suggested that Monty return to his own headquarters by car, but he vetoed this idea immediately as he couldn't face 100 miles of bumpy German roads due to his back injury. Instead, he ordered another aircraft to fly him back, reasoning that no one had crashed twice in one day and the flight back would be the safest he would ever make. At the time, the cause of the crash was investigated by the RAF over fears that werewolf sabotage might have been involved, in effect an attempt to assassinate Montgomery by renegade Nazis. The reason for the crash remains officially engine failure, but the question mark over what actually happened has remained. It is not widely known that the crash had a calamitous effect on Montgomery's health. He was exhausted after 5 years of war, and the crash finished him off. In the winter of 1945-46, Montgomery had repeated bouts of flu and contracted pleurisy, a lung disorder. He ended up in a private sanatorium in the mountains of Switzerland in February 1946. Later he developed arthritis in his back, and an X-ray revealed his spine had been knocked out of shape by the force of the plane crash. He had an operation to straighten it, and it took many years for him to fully recover. There are some interesting parallels between Monty's injury and that suffered by his contemporary General Patton, who dislocated his neck in a car crash in Germany in 1945, ending up paralyzed from the neck down and then dying in hospital. The circumstances of Patton's car crash are covered in another one of my videos, link in the end screen. In 1946, Montgomery became a peer, made the first Viscount Montgomery of Alamein in honor of his greatest victory. He died in 1976 at the age of 88. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.